Hello, 8th graders. So today's video is going to focus on the 7.5 discussion, which is on women's rights. Okay, if you have not done so, before I get into this, if you have not done so, make sure you turn in your guided reading forms for the last two sections. I am putting those in the grade book, so make sure if you have not turned them in that you do so. Okay, make sure you hit the submit button after you fill them out on Google Classroom, and the rest will take care of itself. All right, today 7.5 focuses on women's rights since the entire chapter 7 is focusing on reform movements. Okay, so we had talked about the reform of slavery in prisons and the care of the mentally ill and all of those. So we're going to move on to the reform of how women were starting to be treated in the 19th century. Okay, so if you read on page 413, which is where I am if you want to follow along, that it says that women had few political or legal rights in the mid 1800s. They could not vote or hold office. When a woman married, her husband became owner of all her property. If a woman worked outside the home, her wages also belonged to her husband. And finally, a husband could also hit his wife as long as he did not seriously injure her. Obviously, those are far different than the situations we have to this day. So what we're going to talk about is how we got from that time when things were so wrong to today when things still aren't totally equal, and that's a known fact, but how things have gotten better. Okay, so we're going to look at those reform movements. The early calls for women's rights start with the Grimke sisters that were the abolitionists, the people trying to get rid of slavery. Well, a lot of those abolitionists, including the Grimke sisters, decided to move their focus into women's rights as well. Okay, and this wasn't just women that were fighting for women's rights. There were also a number of men that also believed that women should have equal rights to men during this time period. One of the more famous early women's rights promoters would have been Sojourner Truth. Okay, if you look on page 414, there's a picture of her in the bottom left. Basically, Sojourner Truth was born into slavery in New York. Okay, her original name was Isabella. After she had been freed from slavery when they ended slavery in the North, she had chosen to not only focus on the freeing of other slaves, but as well as giving women rights that she thought they deserved. The reason that she's so famous is because she was such a talented speaker. She would travel throughout the country and give speeches to giant groups of people and use her logic and her interesting way of speaking in order to make those people believe what she was saying. Other famous early women's rights advocates include Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Okay, and those you could say are the two women that really got the movement started. Don't get me wrong, Sojourner Truth was a great start, but Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton really got it started. And the reason why is obviously they had a little more, if you want to call it privilege at this time. Okay, they were not an African American woman; they were white women, which is still viewed as less than a male at this time, but they had that little bit of extra to help them, and they also had more organizational skills. Okay, so what ends up happening is Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton end up working together. Okay, Lucretia Mott is a really good organizer. She gets things together really well. Okay, she sets up petition drives, she does all this type of stuff, but she also has a family, which makes it very difficult for her to go on these long speaking journeys throughout the country, which is where she meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's a great speaker. Okay, so eventually they get together and they decide that they're going to start this women's rights movement together. They eventually, throughout a lot of hard work, they get together. They try and get a giant organization started in the UK or Britain. Okay, but it doesn't really come together. They eventually do get a giant women's rights movement together, though, in what is called, I believe, Seneca Falls. Yes, Seneca Falls, New York. Okay, and that becomes called the Seneca Falls Convention. And here's why that's important. Okay, it's the first major convention for women's rights. There were over 200 women there and 40 men, okay, which is pretty impressive considering that at this time period, most men did not believe that women were equal to men. So considering that there were 40 of them there, that's rather impressive. Okay. At this convention, they sign what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. Okay, and what that is it's based on the Declaration of Independence that the United States used to break away from Britain. Okay, this document that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott wrote, the Declaration of Sentiments, is kind of saying why they believe that women deserve equal rights to men. Okay, and in there they list a couple of things. For example, it starts off saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." And this is an important line because in the Declaration of Independence, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." So in their document, they create it where it says all men and women are created equal, which kind of sets the tone for what they are trying to accomplish at this convention. Now, in this document at the convention, they're trying to make resolutions or these kind of things that they want the government and other people to give them. Okay, so some of these things that they come up with are they demand that equality for men and women at work, at school, and at church. Okay, those are pretty basic things, but they want those equalities. And the only one that really met any opposition at all, which means that even the people at this convention are like, I don't know about that one. Okay, is that these women requested that they also have the equal opportunity to vote. Okay, and that was the only one that received any thought of maybe we shouldn't do that at all. But they ended up passing that one as well. So all four of those things were included on their Declaration of Sentiments. Okay, so they want equality at church, they want equality in education, they want equality at work, and they also want the right to vote. Okay, those are pretty simple things that everybody enjoys, or not everybody, but most people enjoy in the United States today, okay, that women were not able to do during this time period. In just a second, on page 415, we're going to talk about the next famous woman who gets involved in the women's rights movement that I'm sure many of you have heard about before. Susan B. Anthony, okay, and she's the one who really gets what's called the women's rights movement moving. Okay, the reason that she gets so involved is because both of these women that we've talked about before, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, do have families. Okay, I think Lucretia Mott had 5 children and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 7. Okay, so they, at this time period, were believed to have, their job was to take care of those kids. Okay, not the way it's kind of viewed today, but that's how it was then. So they had a lot to do in trying to make these speeches. Susan B. Anthony did not have that obligation, so she was free to travel throughout the country and do these speeches. And not only was she free to do it, she was very, very good at it. Okay, she campaigned for women's suffrage, which means the right to vote. She campaigned for women having the right to an education, for women having the right in the workplace to keep your own money. These types of basic civil liberties that most people enjoy today that were not given to women at this time. Okay. Susan B. Anthony's biggest thing was voting, though. She believed that women definitely had the right to vote and should be able to vote, because if women couldn't vote, how are they represented in the government, right? That's kind of how it works today. If I think a candidate is best for me, that's who I would vote for. Okay, so at this time, how could any candidate be best for women if women were not able to vote for anybody? So she believed that in order to have women's interests in mind, women needed to be able to vote for political positions. Okay, and she fights really, really hard for that. Unfortunately, she does not live to see the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gives women the right to vote. But they do name the amendment after her. They call the 19th Amendment the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because it does give women the right to vote in the United States. Okay. Finally, one of the last things we're getting towards the end here that we're going to talk about is how women are starting to gain some new opportunities because of these people fighting for their rights. Okay, because of the fights at Seneca Falls, advancements were made in both education, in the workplace, in church, and also in the suffrage movement. Okay, especially with Susan B. Anthony fighting for that suffrage. All right. The biggest one is education, okay? In order to do any of those other things, if you want to be successful in the workplace and you want to be equal, if you want to be successful at that time in the church, if you want to be successful in voting, you have to be educated, right? You have to be able to read, you have to be able to write, you have to be able to do all those types of things. Well, at this time, if women were to go to school, which didn't happen very often, they were often sent to schools where you learned how to do things that were useful to women in that time period. So you learned how to sew, or you learned how to keep a home, or how to take care of children, things like that. Okay, but what they were fighting for is for women to get the same education that men got, which included reading, writing, mathematics, science, all that good stuff that we consider normal school now. Okay, so that's what they were fighting for when they wanted improvements in education. Not only for the right for women to go to school all the time, but for them also to be able to get the same education that men were getting rather than that more of homekeeping education. Okay. In fact, we get to the point where it starts to talk about the first colleges and the first high schools being created for women. Okay, so at this time, obviously, we're starting to see more public education in the New England area for men, but they're also fighting now for women to be able to do that as well. The first colleges are formed that there was very negative thoughts about women going to college. So what they ended up doing is they called them seminary schools. And what a seminary school is it's a place that people will go to get kind of a religious education. So if you wanted to be a priest or a pastor or a nun, if you're at that time period and a female, okay, that's where you would go, is to seminary school. So they called them seminary schools so that women were able to attend. And they actually taught normal education there, okay? So what you're going to see is Mount Holyoke is one of the first women's colleges in the United States. It was actually called a seminary school, but when they were there, they got that real education of science and mathematics and reading and all that good stuff that they were looking for. Okay, because women are starting to become more educated during this time period, it also opens up new employment opportunities, which means new jobs. Okay, because they can now do math and very well, and they've taken science classes. You can read and write really well. You're moving up into these more jobs that require that, such as being in the medical profession, being at this time a religious leader, so a minister or anything like that. Okay, being the one it really talks about is in the medical school. Women start to start medical schools. They start medical colleges. They become the first doctors. Okay, even though they'd been helping in the medical field for forever, there had been no female doctors because they couldn't go to college for that. Okay, also it says right here that Antoinette Blackwell became the first American woman to be an ordained minister. Okay, so at that time you had to get a lot of education in order to be a minister. And also women started to become popular teachers because they were able to go to these colleges and get that education. Okay. And there's a graph at the bottom of 417 that shows the amount of female labor force, which means the amount of women that were working in the United States during that time period. If you see in 1800, okay, it's down around 0.2 per million. Okay, and then by 1860, it's all the way up to around 2.0 per million. Okay. Finally, what we're going to look at is the different points of view on contemporary women's issues, which means today. Okay, so far we've talked a lot about how reform has helped women to try and get rights through the 19th century, in the early 20th century. But what we're going to look at is kind of a more modern take on this. All right. So as in the 19th century, different groups have differing points of view on this topic. Okay. Just like in the 19th century, in the 20th century, some women didn't think that women should have more rights. It's kind of the same thing today, right? Because you've been ingrained, or people have been ingrained in this system for so long that they're not sure that it should change. Okay, so some issues today. The most popular issue that people run into is whether or not women should be paid for their maternity leave if you choose to have a child. Okay, and there's some arguments on both sides that it presents in your book on page 418 for this. Of course, the one that most people think of is logically, right? That you're having a child, you deserve to be paid while you're not at work taking care of that child until it's old enough to go by somebody else and you can go back to work. The way most organizations, including the government, are organized now is that women are not paid to take that time. You either have to use your own vacation time or you have to use some other form of income for the amount of time that you take away from work. Okay. A lot of organizations, such as the National Organization for Women, think that that time should be paid. Okay, and the argument against it that it presents right underneath that, okay, the Interdependent Women's Forum, which is another group of women, okay, are saying that requiring employers to pay women during this time would make them less likely to hire women in the first place. Okay, so there are both arguments for and against still to this day. Okay, so those are the reforms and the type of movements that women are still going through to try and get those equal rights. Okay, of course, the right thing to do would be to pay women during that time period, but like that Independent Women's Forum says, if you go right to that, it might make employers less likely to hire women, which isn't a fair thing to do. Okay, so if you have questions about what we talked today, make sure you send me an email or set up a time to Zoom. Okay, make sure you're completing your guided reading forms and getting those turned in. Those are what I am grading you on. Okay, at the end of chapter 7, we do have one more section to talk about after this. We'll have our assessment, and I will explain more about that when we get that far. All right, if you have questions, make sure you contact me, and make sure you stay healthy.